Think about this for a moment. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 500 years. The Mongol Empire, about 150 years. The British Empire at its peak, around 200 years. Now consider ancient Egypt, 3,000 years, not 300, 3,000. From the first pharaoh around 3100 BC all the way to Cleopatra in 30 BC, ancient Egypt endured as a functioning civilization, with the same culture, the same religion, the same institutions, for longer than any other society in recorded human history. Every other great power around it rose, collapsed, and was forgotten. Egypt just kept going. So the question is, why? The answer isn't religion. It isn't military strength, it isn't luck. The answer is economics. Egypt had an economic system so perfectly designed for its environment that it became almost impossible to destroy. And today, we're going to find out exactly how it worked. To understand Egypt's economy, you have to understand one thing first. Everything begins with the Nile. Egypt is essentially a desert, vast, brutal, unlivable desert on both sides. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. There is nothing. But every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. And when it flooded, it deposited a thick layer of dark, fertile silt along its banks. Ancient Egyptians called this land the Black Land, Kemet. And on this narrow strip of black land, they grew enough food to feed millions. Here is what makes this economically extraordinary. The flood was predictable. Every single year, farmers knew the Nile would rise. They knew when to prepare, plant, and harvest. There was no guesswork, no gambling with the weather in the way that other ancient civilizations had to. This predictability was the foundation of everything. Because when agriculture is predictable, you can plan. You can store, you can tax, you can redistribute, you can build institutions around it. Other ancient societies were at the mercy of unpredictable rainfall, drought, and crop failure. Egypt had a flood schedule. This single geographic advantage gave Egypt something almost no other ancient civilization had: a reliable, repeatable agricultural surplus. Year after year. And what you do with that surplus, that is where Egypt's real economic genius begins. In most economies throughout history, money is the medium of exchange. You earn money, you spend money, you save money. Ancient Egypt didn't work that way. Egypt's economy was built on grain. Grain was the currency, grain was the tax, grain was the wage, grain was wealth. Here is how the system worked. The Nile floods, farmers plant, farmers harvest. The state then collects a portion of that harvest as tax, stored in enormous state-run granaries across the country. This grain then flows back out through the economy as wages for workers, rations for soldiers, payments to priests, and supplies for construction projects. Economists call this a redistributive economy. The state acts as the central organizer, collecting resources from producers and distributing them to workers and institutions. And it worked beautifully. The workers who built the pyramids, they were not slaves, as the popular myth suggests. Modern archaeology has revealed that they were paid workers, fed, housed, and provided with medical care from state grain stores. Egypt was running something that modern economists compare to the world's first welfare state. The state also controlled labor through corvée, a system where citizens owed the state a certain number of days of labor each year, particularly during the flood season when farmland was underwater anyway. So thousands of workers were organized, fed from grain stores, and put to work building temples, tombs, and irrigation systems. The flood gave Egypt free time. The grain economy turned that free time into the greatest construction program the ancient world had ever seen. Egypt's economy was not only self-sufficient, it was also deeply connected to the wider world. Even in its earliest periods, Egypt was trading across remarkable distances. Timber came from Lebanon. Egypt had almost no trees suitable for large construction. Cedar logs were floated down from the Levant coast. Copper and turquoise came from the Sinai Peninsula. Gold, enormous quantities of gold, came from Nubia to the south. Incense, ebony, and exotic animals came from the land of Punt, somewhere along the Horn of Africa. These weren't informal exchanges. They were state-organized trade expeditions, funded by the pharaoh, recorded by scribes, and managed as matters of royal policy. Egypt also exported significant goods in return. Grain, linen, papyrus, and finished goods moved outward along trade routes into the Mediterranean. But what really set Egypt apart was state control of the entire economic system. In many ancient civilizations, trade was chaotic, private, and unregulated. Egypt was different. The pharaoh, in theory, owned everything, every piece of land, every worker, every grain of wheat, every ounce of gold. In practice, this was managed by an enormous bureaucracy of scribes, administrators, and officials. Egypt produced some of the earliest and most detailed economic records, accounts of grain harvests, labor allocations, and tax collections. This bureaucratic control meant the state could respond to crises. When harvests were poor, grain stores could be opened. When floods were too high or too low, the administration could redistribute resources from better supplied regions. It was, in many respects, one of the most sophisticated planned economies the ancient world ever produced. So if Egypt's economic system was so effective, why did it eventually end? The answer is a combination of factors, and it unfolded slowly over centuries. The first crack was environmental. The Nile, while generally reliable, was not perfectly consistent. Periods of low floods caused food shortages, weakened the central state, and allowed regional power structures to fragment the country. The second crack was political. Egypt's highly centralized model depended on strong pharaonic authority. When royal succession became contested, or when regional governors accumulated too much independent power, the redistribution system broke down. The third, and ultimately fatal crack, was foreign pressure. By the first millennium BC, Egypt was surrounded by increasingly powerful neighbors: the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and eventually Rome. These weren't just military threats. They were economic competitors with more dynamic, monetized economies. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC and the Greeks introduced coinage, Egypt's ancient redistributive system began its final transformation. By the time Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, the 3,000-year experiment was effectively over. But here is what we should remember. Egypt's economic system lasted longer than any comparable structure in human history. It fed millions of people for 3 millennia. It built civilization's most iconic monuments. It pioneered concepts, bureaucratic administration, state redistribution, labor organization that echo through every modern economy. The lesson of Egypt isn't that it failed. The lesson is that it worked for 3,000 years, and that is a record no civilization has come close to matching. If this gave you a new way of thinking about ancient history and economics, subscribe to OP Vault. Every week, we go inside the economic systems that built the ancient world. We'll see you next time.